pleasure to introduce Robin to you folks and just tell you a little bit about Robin's background before she takes us on a delightful tour of Rockweed. I had an opportunity about 8 years ago to attend a discussion that Robin was giving in Brooksville about rockweed. And coming from a land-bound place, I didn't know anything at all about the intertidal zone or about rockweed. And Robin's presentation really was mind-opening for me. It introduced me to a whole new world, and it changed how I perceived my relationship with the ocean, which is all around us here in this part of Maine. And then more recently, I went to a summer program up in, wasn't in Pembroke, it was in Cedar is where? In Edmonds, which is near Pembroke. This time there was an opportunity to actually get out into the intertidal zone and pull around on the rockweed, slip and slide, and just do an exploration of Robin's work in actual areas that she has been researching, and to just experience that from the perspective of a scientist who has spent a good part of her life working in this area. Robin is a Mainer, I think 8 generations. Her family's been in Maine. She went to Bowdoin, graduated from Yale with a PhD in marine biology. Biology.
Yeah.
And she's also a winner of the Natural Resources Council of Maine Conservation Award, the annual Conservation Award in 2022, specifically for her work on rockweed. So Robin, and also you worked for 10 years down in Appledore.
Yes, I retired. When I retired in 2018, it was from faculty, being faculty at the Shoals.
Yeah, and so doing programs there, working with folks on that whole marine environment. So you're in for a real treat, because Robin has a lot of not only field experience, but a real love of the intertidal zone, and very lucky to have her here to share her knowledge.
Oh,
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that very nice and warm introduction. I want to thank the Brooklyn Climate Response Committee for asking me to come down and talk about something near and dear to my heart, and also of course, the Blue Hill Peninsula Rockweed Forum is co-sponsoring. And thanks to you all for coming out on such a really freezing night. We won't be doing any field trips today, but what I really enjoyed, this is a bit of a different talk for me. Normally I talk on my own research and activities that I'm involved in. Today I'm talking about that, but I'm also, as you will see, the latter part of the talk is not my own research, but library research that I've been doing, reading original academic papers, trying to understand about rockweed and kelp. So today I'm talking about 2, rockweed and kelp, and whether they can mitigate climate change too. And the 2 means we already know a lot about what rockweed and kelp do for the ecosystem. And the question is, can they also mitigate climate change? Can we add that ecological service to the other list of ecological services that we already know about? So let's dive right in. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of what I'm talking about, I just wanted to say that you may not have heard of the Maine Rockweed Coalition, but we're now a statewide organization. We just put out a position statement, which you can find on the website. The QR code is for the website. Basically, we want to make clear our mission is not stopping all industrial scale rockweed harvesting, but our mission is to promote conservation of intertidal marine habitat, including rockweed. And we're all about trying to get a more ecologically sustainable rockweed harvest going. And also, a lot of the photos I have are my original photos, and also photos that I'm using by special permission. So please no recording of photos. So to start at the beginning, you've all seen this graph before, probably it's carbon dioxide rising from about 1960 to about 2020. It's rising globally. And we have opportunities for reducing the amount of carbon dioxide globally by managing both our land and our ocean resources. And improved management of coastal and oceanic ecosystems is right at the ready to contribute to and enhance climate mitigation. So obviously this talk will be about the oceanic part. You probably all know about Maine Won't Wait, Maine's climate strategy, which just came out with a revision in November of 2024. And on page 112, it says Maine should convene a statewide process by the end of 2025 to develop a landscape conservation blueprint that includes coastal habitats for conservation. And the process should identify important habitat types, including blue carbon storage, and biogenic habitats, which include kelp forests. Now, they didn't name rockweed specifically, but I think that's because often you'll find people including rockweed and kelp under the header kelp. So it gets a little confusing. But anytime you see kelp, a lot of the time you can read rockweed and kelp. So that was in the state's plan. And there's a little bit of a personal story here, which is when I first started thinking about seaweed forests and climate, my dream was that companies would purchase carbon credits from Maine landowners who are willing to say no to harvest, as we can in Maine. We don't have to allow rockweed harvest. And that would be a step to protect and conserve their bit of rockweed on the coast from commercial harvest. And then they would be all set up in a carbon credit scheme, and it would all make sense. Conservation, carbon credits, land ownership, protection of rockweed, it would all work together seamlessly. But I got a much better understanding of the complexities of this, and that's most of what this talk is about, is that dream that I have and what happened to it, or that notion that I have and what happened to it. So the talk is going to be in 4 parts. First, we're going to review Maine's seaweed forests, kelp and rockweed, the ecological services that they provide, and the threats to their existence and their functioning. Part 2 is going to review what blue carbon is and where it is in Maine. Part 3 is that question I just referred to. Why can't we just add seaweed, macroalgae, kelp and rockweed to the list of blue carbon resources and issue carbon credits for their conservation? It's a beautiful scheme. What's wrong with that scheme? And part 4, given that I've already hinted that that dream might not come true immediately, what can we do in the meantime? What action steps can we take? And this gives you a sense of the rockweed forest. That's from Cobscook Bay. Beautiful video taken by my friend Adam. Part 1, the seaweed forest, kelp and rockweed, and their services and threats. So here I'm just pointing out we have a terrestrial forest, of course, and a marine forest. And in the intertidal zone, the intertidal, as you may know, is between the high tide line and the low tide line. We have a rockweed zone. And then from the low tide line out further is called the subtidal, and that's where the kelps live. Here we have the rockweed zone, and down here are the kelps. And when you fly over, it looks like this. You can see that beautiful kelp forest in Cobscook Bay. Got a lot of current there, So why do we say a marine forest comprised of marine trees? Well, it's because morphologically, the marine trees are similar to the trees on land in their shape. They have a canopy. There's a tree with a canopy. The rockweed also has a canopy, and the kelp has a canopy. This is kelp. It's Lemonaria digitata, and this is ascophyllum. It has a sort of a trunk. Well, a tree has a trunk, but the marine trees also have a sort of a trunk that we call a stite. And then the tree has a root buried in the ground. Our marine trees have a holdfast, which you may have heard of, which is a structure on the bottom that grabs onto the rock. And notably, it's not buried in sediment. It's usually gripping onto rock. If you do see rockweed in the sediment, it's usually because there's a rock underneath a little bit of sediment. It's grabbed that rock. So that's one key difference. There's an attachment, but one is in the soil and one is in the. So these marine trees in Maine, these rockweeds and kelps, either in the intertidal or kelp in the subtidal, are foundation species. They're ecosystem engineers and they're main primary producers. So they're very, very important to the ecosystem. A foundation species means that it's a species that determines local and regional biodiversity, has a big effect on it, controls ecosystem dynamics. An ecosystem engineer is a similar way of talking about how important these two groups are, the rockweeds and the kelps. An ecosystem engineer is an organism that creates, maintains, or modifies the habitat. So you can imagine the kelps and the rockweeds with their three-dimensional structure. They have a big effect on other organisms that are there and a big effect on how water flows. And then finally, they're primary producers, which means they're photosynthesizers, just the way land plants are. So that previous photo was rockweed. This is kelp, and I want to mention Brian Scarry. BrianScarry.com is his website. He takes absolutely gorgeous underwater pictures, and he allowed me to use these pictures of underwater kelp this evening, for which I'm really grateful. But similarly to rockweed, the subtitle kelps in Maine are also foundation species, ecosystem engineers, and main primary producers. You may be a little more familiar with the term kelp forest because of the California kelp forests, which are a lot more famous in Maine's kelp forest. But this is, I think, a giant kelp, showing you the forest nature of the California kelp forest. Now, it turns out that the first term Maine rockweed forest was used by Rachel Carson in the 1950s. And here's another video that gives you a sense of the school of fish going through that rockweed forest. And she wrote, "Small fishes swim, passing between the weeds as birds fly through a forest. Sea snails creep along the fronds and crabs climb from branch to branch." So she really saw it for the first time as a forest. And that was a very, very apt analogy. So some of the services that kelps and rockweed provide, of course, are shelter and food. It's wildlife habitat, including for species here in Maine that are in decline, like shorebirds that are in trouble. Some wildlife are using it when the water is over the kelps and the rockweed, and some species, like the shorebird, use the rockweed when the tide is out to find little organisms to feed on. These are lesser yellowlegs in Cobscook Bay, and they're one of those species that are in trouble. And this is just an example of how they forage on the rockweed when it's the water's happening. These forests are also fisheries habitat. And then you get that what Rachel Carson described is as if they are birds flying through and they suddenly disappear. And it may interest you to know that the 35 fish species that are known to use the rockweed forest, out of those 35, 20 of them are commercial species, which lends even more imperative to protecting this place for fish. And in particular, I've got Atlantic cod outlined on the left. That's because NOAA has officially designated macroalgal beds like Rockweed as essential fish habitat under the Magnuson-Stevenson Act. So EFH is essential fish habitat. It means the government is recognizing that these macroalgal beds are very special and important places for juvenile cod. And there are lobsters in the Rockweed. At high tide, they come up at night. Yeah, there's some here. And there's a student up above here thrashing, trying to get them to show themselves. There's another one right there. And also juvenile lobsters, those are adults, but juvenile lobsters also use the rockweed as cover for the boulders that they like to live on. So now we'll go into threats to each of these marine forests. So first, the rockweed. The commercial cutting industry for rockweed, I believe, is a threat. This shows the rockweed forest in its natural form in Cobscope Bay in the conservation area. It's not been cut. This shows actually the underside of a mechanical harvester of rockweed. This is the business end of it here, where it's got a great big nozzle, and it goes through the forest and sucks the canopy up into this blade. There's a chopping blade inside, and then the chopped pieces get shot out by a hose and held on the side of the boat. But that's from the underside looking up at the boat like that. And some more images of the rockweed industry. This is a brake harvester boat that's full right up to the gunnels of rockweed. Then a lot of the rockweed that's cut is placed into these bags. There's one ton bag there. These are probably 1 ton bags here. I think this was taken not too far from here. And then the bags get either loaded onto a boat and taken to the processing factory, or without being put in bags, the raw reed that's been cut and taken out of the water is loaded into a big truck, which I hear happened around here in 2021, but I don't know. It has since. So one of the reasons that the Maine Rockweed Coalition is concerned about the commercial rockweed harvest is because the rockweed grows so slowly. And in this, it is very different from kelp. So we've all heard in the media about kelp farms in Maine, and the reason they are successful is because they can seed in the fall or early winter and then harvest in April. And they'll have an 11-foot kelp blade in April from something they seeded in the early winter. Rockweed is not like that. So rockweed, when you cut it down to its regular, height, which that's a regulation height, it can't be cut legally any shorter than that. But when they cut it down to 16 inches, they cut off the canopy. And then if it were left to grow back to its original height, if it were cut in 2023, it would be 2038 based on Cobscope Bay growth rates, before it would reach its original height again. So that's extremely slow growth compared to kelp. And that's why the commercial harvest of rockweed is alarming to a lot of us. So in the rockweed harvest, in a rockweed plant, so to speak, or a rockweed tree, most of the biomass, which the industry is after, is in the canopy. So remember, we saw this terrestrial tree that had a canopy. Rockweed also has a canopy, and you can see how, as it spreads out like that, most of the biomass is up here. So because most of the biomass is in the canopy is the target of the industry, but it's the canopy that facilitates the recruitment, growth, and survival of understory organisms, which mean the organisms underneath the top of the plant. The foundational role of the canopy is thus also responsible for sustaining numerous trophic pathways, that means food web pathways, thus favoring the stability of the functioning of the intertidal zone. So that canopy is really, really important, but unfortunately, it's also what's targeted by the industry. And here I'm showing I hope I'll have time to show this new animated video we made at the end. But it's showing just a clip from that video, showing how the canopy is being removed. And then down here, we have some ducks. I wanted to show a video of how important that canopy is to foraging ducks. And if anybody's a good birder and can tell me what these are, I'd really appreciate it. I think they're juvenile mergansers, but I'm not sure. So see how they go through it, skimming, skimming, skimming. Trying to find those little invertebrates. They're hiding in the very complex tendrils of the canopy. And then they're off. And also, I just want to say, it's not just the canopy taken. Sometimes mistakes are made and whole trees are removed. So this is a very old, over 6 foot rockweed tree that was taken in the harvest. And for scale, I have a young friend of mine lying on the ground next to it for scale. He's about 4'3". And then finally, a photo of rockweed boats unloading some time ago. They often get loaded so you can't even see the boat underneath, but these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boats, and you can see how they're loaded. That represents dead rockweed. That rockweed is on the way to the factory. Now, turning to kelp, what are threats to the kelp forest? This has been in the media lately, and there's that photograph by Brian Scarry again. As Maine waters keep warming, a cry for kelp. And what these researchers found was that in the mid and southern part of the Maine coast, the kelp are really in trouble and really declining. Not so much up where I live on Copscoat Bay, but I have a feeling our time is coming because the water's warming all the time. So warm waters really threaten the kelp. And actually, you probably know sea urchins also are a threat to kelp. But the interesting thing is that even in the, and what this researcher made the point that even in the absence of urchins, so if the urchins were there, they'd be eating the kelp, but even in the absence of urchins, if the water is warming too much, the kelp still are in trouble. So that's what's threatening kelp. And it's not just in Maine. This is a figure from Smalley 2020, impacts of ocean warming on kelp forest ecosystems globally. And you can see the red color is how warm the water is getting. And then for each of these species of kelp globally, it talks about what's happening. Local extinction, decreased abundance, local extinction, decreased abundance, range of contraction. So all over the world, not just here in Maine, the kelps are in trouble. Okay, let's move on to part 2. What is blue carbon and where is it in Maine? So the definition of blue carbon from EPA is that it is carbon that is buried or sequestered away from the atmosphere by coastal ecosystems like salt marshes, seaweeds, and seagrass beds. And again, from Maine Won't Wait, Maine's Climate Strategy Plan, the 2024 edition, it talks about blue carbon goals for the state of Maine. This process should develop a landscape conservation blueprint, including coastal habitats, and identify important habitats like kelp forests, and support the significance to Maine's coastal fisheries. So are all blue carbon resources the same? No, and this is where it starts to get complicated and also interesting. We have 3 types of blue carbon resources called actionable, emerging, and non-actionable. Actionable means we understand how the carbon sequestration works, and people are actually working on methods of issuing carbon credits for protecting or conserving them. Emerging means we think they're a good carbon sequestering resource, or we're not sure, but they should be because there's so much biomass, but it hasn't all been worked out. So that's what's called emerging. And those include macroalgae, the ones we're talking about, rockweed and kelp, but not just wild populations of rockweed and kelp, but farmed kelp. I don't mention farmed rockweed because I've been told multiple times by the people in the business that you can't farm rockweed. And then marine sediments and tidal flats. So the accounting of the carbon, where it's going, where it's being sequestered, how it's being sequestered, how long, that has not been worked out for emerging blue carbon resources. And then on the right, what we consider non-actionable, which is we're not really paying attention because they won't have enough impact, and they include things like marine fauna and coral. And then when you put it in a beautiful picture like this one from Howard et al. 2023, this is for figure 10, but I've added some color to it to sort it out. This is a graph where you have scientific understanding of the carbon pathways from low to high, and on the x-axis, carbon mitigation impact from low to high. And so these are the blue carbon habitats, and this is how they distribute themselves in this two-dimensional scheme. The actionable ones are up here with mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrass. And you can see macroalgae, kelp and rockweed are quite close. Then they're emerging, marine sediments are emerging, tidal flats are emerging, even though the impact is quite low. And then these non-actionable here. So the big question is, why can't we just add seaweed, macroalgae, kelps, and rockweeds to the list of blue carbon resources and issue carbon credits for their conservation? That's the big question. Why can't they be actionable? Why aren't they actionable? Why can't my dream be fulfilled? So carbon markets for marine seaweed forests could create positive incentives that upend the conventional economic motivations that render, and they were talking about tropical, but I added marine forests, more valuable dead than alive. So right now, they're more valuable dead than alive, and we want to upend that, make them more valuable alive than dead. And that was adapted from a Nature Conservancy paper. And this is very dead rockweed forest being loaded on trucks in Brooksville in 2021 by the 1-ton bag. So the way I imagine the scheme could work is that landowners could protect their rockweed forest and the carbon it stores and sequesters by prohibiting commercial harvest. Then organizations could purchase verified carbon credits generated from the additional carbon that would be sequestered in these protected rockweed forests. And then landowners could receive payments for protecting blue carbon in the rockweed by denying permission to harvest or taking other steps to foster rockweed growth. And then finally, if they did that, there would be other conservation benefits simply from preserving rockweed forests. So it would be a win-win situation. So now we have to talk about carbon credits. So what are carbon credits? Carbon credits assign a monetary value to the amount of carbon dioxide or its equivalent that businesses and governments emit. And when an organization purchases a carbon credit, it represents the reduction or removal of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent CO2e from the atmosphere. And the core principles of how this works is you have to have these things. You have to have measurability, additionality, reality, permanence, co-benefits, do no harm, leakage, all that stuff. But with macroalgae, we can stop right here because the problem is measurability. You don't have to look any further. So when salt marshes have carbon credits applied to them, there's like a 100-page protocol on how it all works. What gets measured, what has to be proven. I was astounded. I just looked at the salt marsh one because I thought, I want to see how this works. It went on for pages and pages and pages, all this accounting. So it's quite complicated. But the problem for macroalgae is we don't have even the first part of this, and I'll explain why. So this is a figure adapted from a very famous paper, Krause, Jensen, and Duarte, 2016. They were kind of the ones that got this whole ball rolling. It was redrawn in Cott et al. To 2021, and I show it to you here. And I'll take you through it slowly. So this is a 3-dimension of the shore here and the ocean here. Here's the kelp growing. It's taking up carbon dioxide and it's exporting POC, which is particulate organic carbon, which means bits and pieces of kelp that are starting to break down. And it also exports DOC, dissolved organic carbon, which means carbon dissolved into the seawater. And the question is, the hard part is, where is all this POC going? Where's the DOC going? And where is the carbon ending up? And how much of it is actually ending up buried? And of the stuff that's buried, how much of it is being buried for long enough to be counted as sequestering carbon? So it has to be, the limit is 100 years. It has to be buried for at least 100 years, but preferably longer. And it can't just be locally buried. Ideally, it would be buried in the deep sea, around 4,000 meters down. Or is it kilometers? I can't remember. Anyway, deep. And so this is a 3-dimensional way of looking at it. Windows of macroalgae just means kelps or rockweeds that have been released and are now drifting out to the ocean. And the same thing can happen here. They can break down out of the ocean too. So that's a 3-dimensional way to do it and look at it. And this is sort of a 2-dimensional way of looking at it, but it's the same thing. You start with a macrophyte or a seaweed, and some of the carbon gets remineralized, some of it gets grazed, some of it gets buried in an algal bed. Then you have exported particulate organic carbon, again, the stuff that's where the kelp's breaking down. Exported DOC, the dissolved organic carbon, but then where is it going? How much is going here and there? How much is going there? And that tells you how much total carbon is actually being sequestered. So it's like an accounting, as one author put it, and we're not really sure of the carbon accounting for these seaweeds. That's the problem. So the problem, can carbon sequestration from seaweed forests lead to real climate change mitigation? And for these, I relied on 2 papers, Hurd et al. 2022 and Hesse-Rodona et al. 2023. The challenges include the complexity of atmospheric and ocean carbon dioxide exchange, which is not well understood, rapid turnover of seaweed biomass. So in seaweeds, you're getting a lot more life and death and decay than you are in a tree, for example, that sits in a land forest for decades or 100 years. The third is the potential for carbon export to get into other POC and DOC systems. And then finally, carbon export or burial in marine sediments is really poorly resolved. So the scientists have a lot, and oceanographers have a lot of work to do to figure out these challenges before we can really say that marine forests in Maine or anywhere else are really contributing to real climate change mitigation. But there are reasons for optimism. It's funny, some of the papers you read are really kind of depressing because they're throwing up so many problems. And some papers are really upbeat, like there's a lot of potential here. We really need to study this. So this paper said their high sequestration rates at depth are promising, and understanding macroalgal carbon cycling and their potential role in ocean carbon dynamics is growing quickly, as well as interest in seaweed farming for climate mitigation. So that's a picture of a kelp farm that I took in Casco Bay, kelp on ropes. Another paper that was optimistic, we find that conservation, restoration, and afforestation, that means planting. So restoration would be restoring kelp. Afforestation would be planting kelp. Interventions on macroalgal forests can potentially lead to carbon removal in the order of tens of teragrams of carbon globally. But this will require developing models to figure out what percentage is sequestered, improving techniques to carbon fingerprint seaweeds. So if you get down in the mud and you find carbon, you can figure out where it came from. And then developing methods for carbon accounting, that carbon accounting problem I showed you before, with how much is going here, how much is going there, how much is being grazed, how much is being taken up by their animals. But I also wanted to point out that we have Maine research contributing to this area. Specifically, Dr. Nicole Price, who works at Bigelow Lab, and Dr. Susie Arnold, who works at the Island Institute. And their work actually contributed to a paper that just came out in this January, which is a global study of carbon burial in sediment underneath 20 seaweed farms all around the world, and from Japan to Maine. And you can imagine the Japan ones are quite old. The Maine ones are younger, but they use I think the oldest farm in Maine to compare to. And the question was, how much carbon is buried underneath these seaweed farms in the sediment? And they found that the sediments, that the carbon was being sequestered in the seaweed farm. So where does that leave us? We've got some sort of discouraging challenges to figure out, but encouraging promise of macroalgae is contributing to climate mitigation. But this I compiled as like an action steps that everybody can take. So given that my dream is not dead, but postponed, there's no carbon credit system for Maine's marine forests yet. Everyone can still help protect these forests for their established ecosystem benefits until the time that they do become actionable blue carbon resources. So for rockweed landowners, as we always say, you can say no to commercial harvest of rockweed on private lands in the absence of regulations for what we consider would be an ecologically sustainable harvest. Volunteers can contribute to ongoing projects like the one the Maine Rockweed Coalition has been doing to try to use remote imaging to measure how much rockweed biomass is lost to harvest. Voters can oppose any bills that weaken protections for rockweed. And for kelp, citizens can promote sustainable kelp farming because it seems to be a way that small amounts of carbon actually can be sequestered underneath the seaweed farms, but suitably placed and sized while the science of kelp carbon sequestration is worked out. And that's, again, another clip from the animated video we made. So it's been kind of a short presentation, but in part one, I've tried to describe to you what Maine's seaweed forests are, the kelps and the rockweed, describe their ecological services and some of the threats that they face. In part two, we talked about what blue carbon is and where it is in Maine, the so-called blue carbon habitats that the Maine Won't Wait document talks about. And then part three, why we just can't add seaweed and macroalgae yet to the list of blue carbon resources, and why we won't be issuing carbon credits, I don't think anytime soon, for their conservation. And then part four, steps that we can take. So that's really what I came to talk about today. And I just want to mention that the Maine Rockweed Coalition and I are grateful to these organizations that have contributed funds to support some of the research and the work that we've been doing.
We have time for a few questions.
Yes.
So much of our waterfront is seasonal residents. So how do you protect against rockweed harvesting when people aren't home?
It depends where you are along the coast, because the companies have sort of carved up the coast into sections, and they have different philosophies about that. So around here, I think it's still the Canadian company, and they will take written notice that landowners don't want harvest on their property. And on our website, we have a specific page on our website that's called For Landowners, and it explains all that, explains where to send the notice, and has the notice that you can fill out. And that's not a guarantee, because sometimes the harvesters in the water are different from the people at corporate. So sometimes mistakes are made, but generally the the company's been very good about accepting the no harvest notices, and you can find all that on our website, which is mainerockweedcoalition.org. Yeah.
Dr. Seeley, good job. What are, besides fertilizer, what are some of the commercial capital demands for rockweed and kelp?
So the big one for rockweed is the agricultural and horticultural applications, feed for livestock, and additives like foliar spray for agriculture. And those are called biostimulants. For kelp, it's not used in the same way because it doesn't have the same properties as rockweed for stimulating growth. But kelp is being used a lot for food and for other human needs, not agriculture. So I think most of it is going into food products right now. I mean, you see on the news all the time, kelp spaghetti, kelp beer, you know. Rockweed, on the other hand, is normally not eaten. It's really distasteful. And it's protected by the same compounds that protect oak leaves, so it tastes really bitter. So there's a very, very small list of organisms that can even eat it. So that's why there's that difference between. Yeah.
I think there's under your, action steps, something about promoting sustainable kelp farms. What's an example of a non-sustainable practice that kelp farmers?
Well, we don't want to see, I don't think, on the Maine coast, kelp farm or seaweed farms on the scale that you see it in Asia. So if you look at pictures of kelp farms in Southeast Asia, there's like almost no water. But the whole of the water is being taken up by places that are growing seaweed. Whereas in Maine, we tend to have smaller ones, but we just want to make sure that the whole of the ocean, the coastal ocean around Maine, is not clogged with these mega seaweed farms. So when I say suitably placed, that means in an appropriate spot, and suitably sized, that means sized to the area where it is. Now, if we had ocean marine spatial planning in Maine, which a lot of some states on the West Coast have, spatial planning is a way of looking at all the uses of the ocean all at once and figuring out where these things can go, where these things can go, where these activities can go. And it's a comprehensive view of everything that's going on the coast and looking at everything at once, and then deciding where's the best place for this and that activity. In Maine, we don't have marine spatial planning, unfortunately. So it's kind of a hodgepodge, like everything is separate. So a kelp farm application will get other inputs like, does it get in the way of commercial fishing or does it get in the way of recreation? But there's no overall marine spatial plan. So in my opinion, kelp farms should be supported if they're suitably placed and suitably sized, not like the ones in Asia.
Yeah, just gonna, how do we get to a place where a person needs to say, we're not allowed to harvest from my property, instead of a place where a person needs to ask for permission to harvest?
Yeah, that's a big problem.
How did it happen?
How did it happen that the default is that people come?
Right.
Because this industry got started, well, people have been taking rockweed for a long, long time. But the commercial harvest in the size that it is now only got started in the mid-90s, I think, at least down in Costco where I am. And so it had a lot of momentum, and the business assumed that the rockweed was just like the fish. The fish were in the intertidal, so was the seaweed. So they would just come and take it. And they just assumed that that was the system that was set up. And so it was only until 2015 when there was a lawsuit where the landowner said, you know, we don't actually think that that's public property. We actually think it's private property. So then there was a lawsuit, a 4-year lawsuit from 2015 to 2019. And it ended up that the Maine Supreme Court found that the landowners actually own the marine trees, just like they own the terrestrial trees. But that was a big upheaval, and the industry had already got a real head of steam, thinking it was the other way. So in my naivete, I thought, oh, 2019 Maine court decision, great, you know, the whole system's gonna turn around and landowners are gonna be able to claim their property and all that. And what I didn't realize was there's a lot of work after you get a court decision to actually get it working the way it's supposed to work. And it's still not. I mean, absolutely, it's still not working the way it should. We have some ideas of how to get from A to B, and I'd be glad to talk to you about that further afterwards or by email, but yeah, we've got a ways to go. Yeah.
I got so many questions, I could take a couple of hours. As I understand it, landowners own to the low tide mark, is that correct? And that's what we're talking about.
Unless it's public property, unless it's a
Right.
park or.
Right, but then you can say no down to the low tide mark.
Yeah.
Okay.
But just for seaweed.
Right, I understand it.
Yeah.
So looking at what sequestering, I'm a forester by trade. I've been following the carbon market on trees for quite a while about it.
Oh, good.
The sequestration of the carbon is in the deep ocean. That's where it really counts as being sequestered. Is that true?
That's what I've learned, yep, and for at
Okay.
least 100 years.
Okay. So here's a heretical question. Could you harvest $4 to, it's a commercial product, would you allow harvesting? And then the harvester would have to sequester it in the deep ocean. Rather than turning it into fertilizer, they would have to sequester it in the deep ocean.
I don't see the financial incentive to do that.
Well, there would be a public value, just as there is a public value of fertilizer, there would be just like the carbon market. You're paying to
Oh, I see.
keep carbon in trees. Well,
I see.
now you're paying to keep carbon in the deep ocean that you've harvested as seaweed. Why isn't that under
Well,
consideration?
because that would wreck all the other values that we're talking about. I mean,
Well, no, it would regrow. I mean, we talk 15 years in plant world is very short unless you're mowing your lawn every week.
yeah, but
Right.
if you're an organism or shorebird, you're not gonna sit around for 15 years waiting for the rockweed to grow
Well,
back, because the
right.
shorebirds are already in trouble.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
I thought, but,
If you take every other consideration away,
right, I mean,
possibly.
you basically have an alternative for the commercial value of that. Instead of going fertilizer, you'd have sequestered carbon.
Yep.
That would be the alternative value.
Yep.
And the rockweed will regrow.
If you look at it on a centuries scale, and
No.
if it's allowed to regrow.
That's
The
right.
problem now is you get a little bit of regrowth and the harvesters are right back on top of it. It's not like they leave a
Yeah,
rock.
but you're the controller of that. You're the landowner that owns it.
Yes and no. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, if you're not there all the time.
That.
I mean, how,
There are ways to deal. I told you it was an heretical question.
I know.
That's okay.
how do absentee forest owners handle that? How do absentee forest owners handle that problem?
They basically sold, it's like what's called the old timber deed, where you sold your carbon for a period of time. You could do the same with seaweed, where somebody else would then own it for that 15 years or whatever you want to regrow it.
Yeah.
So,
I hear what you're saying, but I don't think we have enough time. I'm worried about the organisms that depend on it now. I mean, you're talking about long time horizons, and
What?
I don't think we have that much time.
well, you see, I function on a very different time frame. than
Yes.
most people.
Yeah. Yes. Did your website, obviously as consumers and people who like to farm, give us more than don't buy the thing called rockweed fertilizer, also don't buy the thing. Do you understand what I'm asking? If I want to not get something from Fedco, I know not now, we cannot get the rockweed fertilizer, but are there other products? Does your website tell us what to boycott? No. No, we don't talk about boycotting. We just say, in our opinion, in 2025, nobody should be buying any kind of product that says seaweed on it or kelp unless it says specifically farmed. I have no problem with products being made with farmed seaweed. The problem is the products I'm talking about almost always are using ascophyllum because of rockweed because of rockweed's properties. And it almost never says rockweed. It says kelp. So if you go to your hardware store and you buy a product that has, and you say, seaweed, it's so natural, I want to put it on my, and you read it, it'll say kelp. If you look at the back of the package, it'll often say, if it says the ingredient, ascophyllum nodosum, which is rockweed. It's not kelp. But that's what's so confusing in an agricultural context. All rockweed is kelp. Not the kind of kelp we've talked about, but it's, remember I said at the beginning that sometimes rockweed and kelp are grouped together as kelp. But almost never will you see this seaweed came from farm. And my point is we need to be taking the pressure off the wild kelp and off the wild rockweed. Use the farmed kelp all you want in these products, but that's my personal opinion. Yeah.
Are there other species of seaweed along our coast other than rockweed or kelp?
Oh, many. But they don't form forests. The ones I'm talking today are the forest forming ones.
Thank you.
And so you can sort of in your head divide the seaweed along the coast of Maine into eating seaweed, sea vegetables, and ecosystem structuring seaweeds, the brown seaweeds that have that three-dimensional structure. So if you eat sea lettuce or dulse or anything like that, that's not creating a three-dimensional structure. That's just, it's turf. It's like on the bottom. It has a short lifespan, it grows a lot, covers a lot of area, but it doesn't have the effects on all the other organisms in the ecosystem because it's not creating that structure. It's not an ecosystem engineer. The reason the marine forests, the seaweed forests are so important because they are creating that three-dimensional structure and many other parts of the ecosystem and organisms depend on it. That's the difference. So you don't need to worry about eating sea lettuce or anything like that.
Well, I'm safe as far as that goes.
So if you actually go back to the analogy with the tree carbon market, then you can use exactly the same model for seaweed. The carbon market for trees is basically where we will pay you not to cut the trees. A brand new market that never existed before. You could do exactly the same thing. The same people that buy tree carbon can buy seaweed carbon for a period of time. We'll pay you for 15 years or 20 years, however long your contract is, not to cut it.
Will you give me your email afterwards? Because I'd like to talk more about this with you.
I mean, that market exists now for trees.
Oh, I know. Yes.
How does warming,
Oh, I'm sorry. Gonna have the gentleman in the yellow scarf first.
Is there any instance of a town prohibiting harvesting of rockweed?
No.
Is that possible?
I've been told by an attorney that what is possible is putting in municipal regulations that would add to the state regulations on rockweed harvest. So if the town, for example, a harvester would come in and get a municipal permit for rockweed harvesting, they would have to show where they're going to harvest and prove they had permission. A town could do that. I've been told. So that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
How will you quantify the rockweed? I mean, sometimes I have more and sometimes I don't have it.
There are actually ways of going out and in the field, bagging it up and then weighing it. You can even follow individual plants if you want over time and see how much they add in their weight. Sorry, Deb, did you have another?
my big question is, how is warming ocean affecting property?
How's warming ocean affecting property?
Rockweed.
Oh, rockweed, sorry. Not so much. not as much as kelp. So you've heard that with a warming ocean, species are shifting up northward, like we're worried about the lobsters continuing to shift their distribution. Rockweed is not going to be affected so much, except for at the northern extreme and the southern extreme. The people that have researched this seem to say that it's going to be pretty stable. It's not like kelp, where the warming temperatures in the Gulf of Maine are really hitting it hard. And they started to see this a long time ago, and now it's accelerating. Right? But so yeah, the warming temperature, ocean temperature seems to have that very different effect on rockweed.
So I had a couple of questions. One is a process question. You talked about the assessing the sequestration in the bottom or in the sedimentary area, and my head went. I jumped to the conclusion, oh, they must be taking core samples. Is that in fact what? And how deep do you go with the core samples?
No, this is not my area of research, so I'm not
okay.
really sure.
Okay,
but
that is the mechanism.
I believe that is the way they do it. And
Okay.
the way they trace it, but there was one paper that talked about actually looking at DNA, like assessing the DNA of what's in the sediments and trying to figure out how much came from the kelp and how much came from another type of seaweed. So it's really getting quite sophisticated.
Wow, yeah.
That's why I have a lot of hope that this will actually work someday, just
Okay.
not right now.
All right. The other thing I wanted about, you talked about, and I've forgotten the name, but this comprehensive planning view that's being done on the West Coast.
Marine spatial planning.
Okay, and marine spatial planning, and we don't do it here. What are the obstacles? Technology, regulatory, something about
I think
the
political
geography?
will. Political will, and maybe, I mean, what's really fascinating is to go to the state, I think it's Washington or Oregon, I think Washington. They have a whole website for their marine spatial planning, the regulations that go along with it, the studies that have been produced. It's really impressive, and it's obviously many, many years of work and probably lots and lots of money. So I'm sure part of it is a funding thing. I mean, there's expertise in the state of Maine for people who could jump in and start doing it. I really don't know. I don't really know what the holdup is. But
So it sounds
definitely-
like it's a prioritization question more than anything else.
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, other states have done it. There's certainly no lack of,
And no states on the East Coast do this, or?
I don't really know. Massachusetts comes to mind, but I'm not really sure about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Seeley.
Thanks.
Thanks,
You've all
Andy.
learned a lot.